So, I've recently found myself rewatching the MCU's Infinity Saga, because, let's face it, most of the recent movies have been both uninspired and completely nonsensical in nature. Anyway, Avengers Endgame was my latest completion, and I must say the movie has not aged very well.
What did you say?
Now, I'll be the first to admit that I came out of this movie placing it in the top 5 MCU projects, but once the facade of spectacle had lifted, the highly contrived plot with several huge issues in the script, mainly focused around the time travel elements of the story, were revealed. Now, other YouTubers have talked about how ridiculous the time travel decisions and sequences are in Endgame, and there are issues within the final battle that I will discuss later on in the video. But before that, I actually wanted to talk about another scene, and one which I immediately called into question after leaving the cinema, and that is the charge of the Avengers towards Thanos' incoming army. It felt strange and, quite frankly, suboptimal as far as battle strategy is concerned. I mean, let's think about it for a second. The majority of our allied forces have access to guns and other ranged weapons. We saw them utilizing these in the early stages of the assault on Wakanda in Infinity War. The reason they couldn't sustain this for a long period was due to the enemy moving around the perimeter of the shield to attack Vision, who was in a fixed location, and had to remain there for the duration of the battle. But here in Endgame, you have a huge array of fully mobile heroes who are essentially playing hot potato with the Infinity Gauntlet throughout the battle, and you are fighting an army whose primary mode of attack is melee based, punching, kicking, biting. This kind of full frontal attack is a real waste of range advantage, which you should have optimized. You'd think that any kind of strategic bomber or some aircraft could cause significant damage to Thanos' forces. I mean, you have access to F-15s but prefer to use spear warriors. I mean, who am I kidding? There are many problems with this whole sequence. I mean, why doesn't Thanos just rain fire on the Avengers while they're portaling in? Why doesn't Doctor Strange portal sections of Thanos' army into another dimension? Heck, why doesn't he trap Thanos in the mirror dimension? Or portal the gauntlet to Kamar-Taj or the Himalayas? These are all genuine issues, but I want to focus on the initial charge itself and compare it to another scene in a much better movie.
The beacons are lit! Gun knuckles for 8! And Rohan will answer.
The Return of the King is the final installment in the cinematic masterpiece that is The Lord of the Rings, and I stand by my statement that it is the greatest trilogy of all time, and I would be genuinely interested in hearing other contenders. Amongst the movie's glory is the Ride of the Rohirrim, a truly great scene that other movies have tried to emulate, including Endgame. Everything about the scene works. The reaction of the orcs to the arrival of Rohan's forces, Theoden seeing his childhood city burning and succumbing to the forces of Mordor, the speech he gives before the heroic charge, it's all balanced perfectly. The switch in fortune of battle to the defenders of Minas Tirith, in their greatest hour of peril, is a significant turning point in the battle for Middle-earth. This was the first time since the First Age that an army of men and men alone had drove back the forces of darkness, and the fear that overcomes the orcs is something that Sauron, and they themselves, could not comprehend. I understand why the Russo brothers wanted to mirror this scene, but it's important to remember that these two events exist in very different eras. I mean, Lord of the Rings takes place in a medieval setting, in which mounted charge was the best way to cover large areas of ground between yourself and the enemy lines. The enemy who, by the way, are using volleys of arrows to weaken this cavalry charge. But once that fails, the ground forces are left exposed and the tight formation is dispersed. There are no powerful ranged weapons that can obliterate large sections of army and land, or wizards who can remove entire sections of a battlefield at will. The Ride of the Rohirrim works because it showcases the breaking and prevention of a siege in the most appropriate and logical way. They maintain the spectacle without sacrificing the storytelling. Endgame, unfortunately, only succeeds with one of these. Now, I understand that comparing battle scenes in movies is not very straightforward, especially battles in very different settings. This is because there really isn't an objective standard for how warfare should be waged. But saying that, there are certain factors that make for a more coherent and well-paced battle scene. One of these, and this is something that Endgame in particular needs, is an understanding of where our heroes are during the critical moments in the conflict. Now, the reason I stress the importance of this in Endgame is because we are not just dealing with a standing army. We have many enhanced soldiers who scale very differently in power. For example, in the climax of the battle, where Thanos is grappling with the Avengers for the gauntlet, we don't have any sense of where the most overpowered hero, being Wanda, is. This calls into question, could she not have dealt with Thanos instead of Tony? Now I realise that his sacrifice is a key moment in the movie and probably the most powerful moment in the MCU. It doesn't change the fact that the lead up to his death feels very contrived. Because by this stage of the battle, the enemy forces have been greatly diminished thanks to the addition of Captain Plank into this finale.
No, I want to be the first me, not the next Tom Cruise. Thank you very much.
Well.
This, by the way, was a horrible decision made by the writers because as soon as she arrives, you can throw all progression and tension of the battle out of the window. Anyway, by this stage, Wanda could absolutely deal with Thanos by herself, whilst he's struggling to get the gauntlet. I mean, if Tony and Cap could, it wouldn't be an issue for her. Without the gauntlet, there would have been several heroes, including Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, or Captain Plank, although she was knocked out during the scene, who could have done so much more to either kill Thanos or remove the gauntlet from the battlefield. Which, by the way, that should have happened much earlier on, but whatever, we're addressing the scene as it currently is. I guess my point is that all these contrivances could have been made more plausible if we had an idea about their respective locations within the battlefield. We don't need to map out each section in detail, which is what you see more so in Lord of the Rings, especially with the Siege of Helm's Deep. We just need distinguishable areas. Even with the scene where Doctor Strange is holding back the water, we know from the brief shot of Avengers HQ where that place is in regard to other parts of the battlefield. We need more scenes like this that give enough context as to the whereabouts of each major player in the final act, because without this, we're left to question the necessity of the more impactful scenes, including Tony's sacrifice. Now, funnily enough, the most ridiculous parts of this battle involve the time travel elements, and the plan involving the van. Firstly, it's important to mention that this van is right behind enemy lines. Captain Plank is flying towards it at car speed, despite her being able to fly at light speed. And this is why Thanos is able to stop her. I mean, she's basically a gauntlet delivery service. This scene is ridiculous. Going back to my earlier point about military formation, it would have made more sense to have the Avengers defending the Infinity Gauntlet and at least make the enemy come to you. But this isn't even the main problem with this scene. That would of course be the decision to send Captain Plank through the time machine to return the Infinity Stones to their locations. What on earth do they expect her to do here? She wasn't involved in the time heist. She has no idea where to return each stone to. And even if she did, she has no means of navigating the time stream. You need one of those wristbands for that. This whole plotline it doesn't make any sense, and it breaks apart in almost every way, and it should not play out as it does. And my god, as much as it pains me to accept it, the Loki series is MCU canon, and this just makes the plan to return stones to their original timeline completely pointless. This is because the show establishes that everything is happening in one timeline, or the sacred timeline. In other words, every time you go back in the past, you create a nexus event that results in that new timeline being pruned. So how can Captain America return the stones to their original timelines? Because those timelines no longer exist. Now you could argue, and defenders of the show would argue, that the TVA allowed these variant timelines to exist long enough for the stones to be returned, and then pruned them. However, this begs several questions. How did Steve Rogers remain in that timeline for all those years? Was a Space Stone returned to the 2012 timeline or the 70s timeline? And do either exist? Because if the sacred timeline involves Loki not picking up the Tesseract, then the Avengers never go to the 70s, because they would have collected all the Infinity Stones from the 2012 timeline. There are so many issues with this show that unfortunately create further problems for one of the key parts in Endgame's battle, which is returning the Infinity Stones with the time machine. Whenever writers try and include time travel into these movies, they hardly maintain consistency with the different forms of time travel, and it normally creates a messy script. It's best to stay away from it if you can.
The Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time. Remove one of the stones, and that flow splits. Now this may benefit your reality, but my new one, not so much.
Once I isolated our timeline,
all I have to do is manage the flow of time and prevent any further branches.
We can return each one to its own timeline. So, chronologically, in that reality, it never left.
Reset the timeline.
You have to return the stones to the exact moment you got them.
back in the game.
But there you go. That's just a brief breakdown of one of the scenes that I found more irritating to watch. Obviously, I love studying medieval warfare, and from as I said, a battle strategy standpoint, the charge scene and what was happening during the battle just felt strange and suboptimal. I enjoyed the movie, and I continue to enjoy the movie. However, I would be the first to admit that the movie breaks scripts at many points. From a plot sense, it's worse than Age of Ultron. But that's the thing, and that's understanding the difference between movies being good and movies being liked. You can have a good movie that's not liked. Likewise, you can have a bad movie that's liked. I myself love Good Burger. It is a broken movie. I would find it very difficult defending this movie from an objective sense if I were challenged on that issue. But yeah, that's the video. I felt this was one of the things I wanted to talk about. I'm working on more projects at the moment, writing scripts for them. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, turning on notifications, and I will see you all in the next upload. Take care.
Now taking the Holy Stories and